In the depths of space, where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists a universal truth that every species learns. Fear is the great equalizer. For millennia, the Galactic Council believed they understood terror, the cold dread of extinction, the paralyzing anxiety of the unknown, the primal panic of being hunted. But they were wrong. Fear, true fear, doesn't come from being the prey. It comes from realizing you've been hunting alongside apex predators your entire life, mistaking them for harmless companions. It comes from the moment you understand that the species you've dismissed as young and reckless possesses something far more terrifying than claws, venom, or psychic abilities. It comes from watching humans fight. This is the account of HFY, a seasoned Cytherian warrior who thought he had seen every form of combat in his 3 centuries of life. A being who had faced down the mechanical horrors of the Nexus, survived the psychic storms of the Void Touched, and emerged victorious from battles that claimed entire worlds. Until the day he stood shoulder to shoulder with humanity's finest, and learned that courage and madness are often separated by the thinnest of lines. Until he discovered that some species don't just fight to survive, they fight because they've turned war itself into an art form. This is his story. This is how he learned what fear truly was. HFY's crystalline carapace caught the artificial light of the war room as he shifted his weight. The familiar weight of his plasma rifle, a comfort against his four-armed frame. Around the holographic tactical display, representatives from 7 different species studied the glowing red mass that represented their enemy. The Devourers had taken another system, their biomechanical ships leaving nothing but stripped planets in their wake. The Cytherian warrior had seen this dance before. Each species would posture, debate strategy, argue about resource allocation, and eventually settle on a conservative approach that minimized losses while maximizing political advantage. It was the way of the Galactic Council. And after 3 centuries of military service, HFY had grown accustomed to the careful, calculated nature of interstellar warfare. The enemy fleet consists of approximately 300 bioships, Admiral Thexra announced, her tentacles dancing across the holographic controls. Standard Devourer configuration. They've established a beachhead on Kepler 442b and are systematically harvesting the population. A collective shudder ran through the assembled commanders. The Devourers were efficient in their cruelty, converting organic matter into fuel for their ships, while keeping the neural networks intact to power their computation systems. It was a fate that even the most hardened warriors feared. Our combined fleet strength is 400 ships, continued the Admiral. We have numerical superiority, but their bioships are notably more resilient than our conventional vessels. Standard engagement protocols suggest a siege scenario, cutting off their supply lines and waiting for. With respect, Admiral.
A new voice interrupted, and every head in the room turned toward the human delegation.
HFY's compound eyes focused on the speaker, a relatively small bipedal creature with pale skin and short brown hair. Commander Sarah Chen wore the simple grey uniform of the Terran Defense Force, unremarkable except for the array of scars that crisscrossed her visible skin. Humans had been part of the Galactic Council for only 50 standard years, and their military contributions had been minimal at best. Those people down there don't have time for a siege, Chen continued, stepping forward to examine the hologram. Every hour we delay costs thousands of lives. Admiral Thexra's chromatophores shifted to a dismissive purple. Commander, your species' tendency toward rash action is well documented. A direct assault would result in unacceptable casualties. HFY watched the human's face carefully. In his centuries of experience, he had learned to read the micro-expressions of different species, to understand when diplomacy was about to break down. What he saw in Commander Chen's eyes wasn't anger or frustration, but something far more unsettling. A cold, calculating assessment, as if she were measuring each alien in the room for a coffin. You're right, Chen said finally. A direct assault would be costly, but you're thinking like prey animals. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. General Korvax of the Draknari Supremacy, whose people prided themselves on their warrior culture, rose to his full 3-meter height. Human, you dare! I dare to point out that you're all thinking defensively, Chen interrupted, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. You see 300 ships and think about how to minimize losses. You see bioships and think about their resilience. You see a siege as a safe option. She tapped the hologram, zooming in on the enemy formation. But you're not seeing the opportunities. HFY found himself leaning forward despite himself. There was something in the human's tone, a confidence that bordered on arrogance that demanded attention. Bioships are resilient, yes, Chen continued, but they're also organic. They feel pain. They can be terrified. They can be confused. She manipulated the display, highlighting tactical positions, and they're arranged in a feeding formation, not a defensive one. They think they're safe. What are you suggesting? Admiral Thexra asked, though her tone suggested she was already regretting the question. Chen smiled, and Zephyr felt something primal stir in the depths of his consciousness. It wasn't the polite expression of diplomatic friendship that humans usually wore in council meetings. This smile belonged on the face of a predator. I'm suggesting we teach them what real fear looks like. The room erupted in protests and questions, but Zephyr remained focused on the human commander. In her eyes, he saw something that 3 centuries of warfare had taught him to recognize, the look of someone who had not just survived impossible odds, but had thrived in them. The Terran fleet is small, Chen said, once the noise died down. 12 ships, but we volunteer to be your vanguard. She gestured to the tactical display. Give us 6 hours to soften their defenses, and your main fleet can advance with minimal casualties. 12 ships against 300? General Korvax scoffed. It's suicide. Is it? Chen asked. Tell me, General, in all your warrior culture's history, how often have you fought an enemy that was actively trying to traumatize you? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Zephyr found himself considering it seriously. Draknari warfare, like most civilized combat, followed established patterns, objectives, tactics, rules of engagement. Even in the most brutal conflicts, there was an underlying structure, a logic that made sense. Terror isn't just a byproduct of war, Chen continued. For humans, it's a tool. We've spent our entire evolutionary history making other species afraid of us, and we've gotten very good at it. Admiral Thexra's tentacles had gone completely still. You're talking about psychological warfare on a scale that would constitute war crimes? Chen shook her head. Against the Devourers? They're not signatories to any convention. They don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They're parasites, and sometimes the only way to deal with a parasite is to make it afraid to feed. Zephyr spoke for the first time since the meeting began. What exactly are you proposing, Commander? Chen turned to him and he felt the weight of her attention like a physical force. We're going to show them something they've never seen before, Captain. We're going to show them what it looks like when prey fights back. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the ship's life support systems. Jeff Hay considered the proposal, weighing it against everything he knew about human capabilities. Their ships were small, their technology adequate but not exceptional, their numbers laughably insufficient. By every rational metric, Chen's plan was insane. And yet, the Devourers feed on fear, Zephyr said slowly. They use it to control their victims, to break resistance before they begin harvesting. If that fear were redirected.
Exactly. Chen nodded.
Fear is a tool, and like any tool, it can be turned against its user. Admiral Thexra's chromatophores had shifted to an alarmed orange. Even assuming your plan has merit, 12 ships cannot possibly... You're still thinking about this, Ron? Chen interrupted. You're thinking about ships and firepower and tactical advantage. I'm thinking about something much simpler. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm thinking about what happens when something that spent its entire existence as the apex predator suddenly discovers it's being hunted. The holographic display shifted as Chen input new parameters, showing the human fleet's proposed approach vector. It was unlike anything Zeph Hay had ever seen in formal military doctrine, aggressive, unconventional, and utterly without regard for established safety protocols. The beauty of terror warfare, Chen explained, is that you don't need to win every fight. You just need to make your enemy believe that fighting you isn't worth it, and the Devourers have never fought anyone who actively wanted to hurt them. This is madness, General Korvax growled. Even if you could damage their forces, the risk is acceptable. Chen cut him off. Because, unlike every other species in this room, humans understand something fundamental about war. She looked around the room, meeting each alien gaze in turn. We understand that sometimes, the only way to save lives is to be willing to take them in the most efficient way possible. Zephyr felt a chill run down his spine. In 3 centuries of warfare, he had never heard anyone speak about killing with such casual professionalism. It wasn't bloodlust or anger that motivated the human commander. It was something far more unsettling. a complete and total acceptance of violence as a legitimate tool of statecraft. "You're asking us to trust you with the lives of millions," Admiral Thexra said quietly. "No," Chen replied. "I'm asking you to trust us with the deaths of our enemies. There's a difference." The room fell silent again. And He found himself studying the human delegation more carefully. They were all similar to Chen, calm, professional, and carrying themselves with the confidence of people who had seen the absolute worst that the universe had to offer and emerged victorious. There was something fundamentally different about them, something that set them apart from every other species he had encountered. They weren't afraid, not of the devourers, not of death, not of making the hard choices that others would shy away from. They stood in that room like people who had already calculated the acceptable cost of victory and found it reasonable.
"What do you need from us?" Zeph-Hai heard himself ask, and was surprised by the question.
He had intended to remain silent, to observe and report back to his superiors. Instead, he found himself drawn into the human's confidence. Chen smiled again, and this time Zeph-Hai recognized the expression for what it was, the look of a hunter who had just found the perfect hunting partner. "We need you to bear witness," she said simply, "because when this is over, when the devourers are running from shadows and jumping at their own reflections, someone needs to be able to tell the rest of the galaxy what they saw." Admiral Thexra's tentacles writhed in agitation. "This conversation is beyond my authority. I need to contact the council." "By all means," Chen nodded. "But while you're explaining to politicians why saving lives quickly is somehow morally inferior to saving them slowly, we'll be making our approach. The Terran Defense Force doesn't require council authorization to defend human interests." It was a not-so-subtle reminder that humanity, while part of the Galactic Council, maintained its independence and could act unilaterally when circumstances required it. The legal implications were staggering, but Chen seemed utterly unconcerned by them. "Captain Zeph-Hai," Chen said, turning back to the Catherian warrior, "your people have a reputation for honor in combat. Would you be willing to observe our operations? As a professional courtesy?" Zeph-Hai found himself nodding before he fully understood why. "I would be honored, Commander." "Excellent. Report to Docking Bay 7 in 2 hours. We launch at 1400 ship time." As the meeting dissolved into urgent discussions and frantic communications with higher authorities, Zeph-Hai lingered, watching the human delegation prepare to leave. They moved with the efficiency of a well-trained unit, but there was something else. Something that nagged at the edge of his consciousness. They were excited, not the nervous energy of soldiers preparing for a difficult mission, but the genuine enthusiasm of people about to engage in their favorite activity. It was like watching artists prepare for a performance, or scholars about to deliver a lecture on their life's work. As Commander Chen passed him on her way to the door, she paused. "Captain, you might want to review your species' psychological warfare protocols. What you're about to see, it might change your perspective on a few things." "Commander," Zeph-Hai said, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully, "in 3 centuries of military service, I have seen every form of warfare practiced by civilized species. What makes you so confident that your methods will be effective?" Chen's smile was predatory, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Because, Captain, civilized species fight to win. Humans fight to make sure our enemies never want to fight again." With that, she was gone, leaving Zeph-Hai alone with the tactical display and a growing sense that he was about to witness something unprecedented in the history of galactic warfare. 2 hours later, as he made his way to Docking Bay 7, Zeph-Hai reflected on the strange turn his career had taken. He had requested assignment to this joint operation as a routine observation mission, expecting to file a standard report on human military capabilities. Instead, he found himself walking into what the humans called a learning experience. The docking bay was a hive of activity, with human technicians making final preparations to their ships. The vessels themselves were unremarkable, mid-sized frigates with standard armament, and nothing that would distinguish them from 1,000 other warships in the galaxy. It was only when Zeph-Hai looked closer that he began to notice the differences. The weapons arrays had been modified with components he didn't recognize. The sensor packages were larger and more sophisticated than anything he had seen on a ship that size. And the crews moved with the precision of people who had done this many times before. Captain Zeph-Hai? A young human ensign approached him, her uniform crisp and her manner respectful. "Commander Chen requests your presence aboard the TDF Retribution. If you'll follow me." As they walked through the corridors of the human ship, Zeph-Hai noted more unusual modifications. The lighting was dimmer than standard, the corridors wider than necessary, and there were systems he couldn't identify humming quietly in the walls. Everything about the ship suggested it had been designed for a very specific purpose. "Commander," Zephi said as he entered the bridge, "I must admit I'm curious about these modifications to your vessels." Chen looked up from a tactical display that showed far more detail than should have been possible at this range. "Psychological warfare requires specialized equipment, Captain. We've had 50 years to perfect our techniques." 50 years? But humans have only been in space for... We've only been in galactic space for 50 years, Chen corrected.
We've been practicing warfare for considerably longer than that.
She gestured to a chair that had been hastily modified to accommodate his physiology. "Please, make yourself comfortable. We'll be dropping out of hyperspace in 30 minutes. As the ship prepared for transition, Zephi found himself studying the human crew. They were calm, professional, and utterly focused on their tasks. There was none of the nervous energy he would have expected from people about to engage a numerically superior enemy. "Tell me, Commander," he said, "what exactly should I expect to witness?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical. "Captain, every species in the galaxy has learned to fight, but humans learned something else first. We learned how to make other things afraid of us. It's the reason we survived our homeworld, the reason we became the apex predator on a planet full of creatures bigger, stronger, and faster than us." She turned to look at him directly, and Zephi felt that chill again. "We're about to show the Devourers what it feels like to be prey." The transition from hyperspace was unlike anything Zephi had experienced in 3 centuries of space travel. Instead of the standard gradual emergence that minimized sensor disruption, the human fleet dropped into normal space with what could only be described as violent precision. The tactical display immediately came alive with enemy contacts, but instead of the cautious positioning he expected, the human ships were already moving. "Contact," announced the sensor operator, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism that seemed to characterize all human military personnel. 312 bioships in feeding formation around Kepler 442b. They're beginning to react to our presence. Zephi watched the tactical display with growing amazement. The Devourer fleet was indeed caught completely off guard, their ships scattered in the loose formation typical of a species that had never faced serious opposition. Bioships were living creatures, massive organisms bred and modified for space combat, and they moved with the sluggish grace of creatures that had grown complacent. "Commander Chen," came a voice over the communications array. "This is Admiral Thexra. Our main fleet is holding position as agreed, but I must protest this approach vector. You're heading directly into the center of their formation." Chen didn't look up from her console as she responded.
Acknowledged, Admiral.
"Beginning Phase 1 of psychological operations." "Phase 1? Zephi asked, but Chen held up a hand for silence. "All ships, this is Retribution Actual. Execute Terra Protocol 7. Weapons free, but remember, we're not here to destroy them all. We're here to teach them to be afraid." What happened next would haunt Zephi's dreams for years to come. The human ships didn't simply attack, they performed. Each vessel had been equipped with specialized broadcasting equipment that flooded local space with a cacophony of sounds. Human voices screaming, laughing, singing war songs in a dozen different languages. The bioships, accustomed to the fear and despair of their victims, suddenly found their sensory organs overwhelmed with something they had never encountered: the sound of predators enjoying themselves. "Bioships communicate through bioelectric fields," Chen explained as she monitored the enemy response. "They're essentially one massive nervous system spread across the fleet. What we're doing is introducing foreign electrical patterns into that system." On the display, Zephi could see the bioships beginning to cluster together, their movement patterns shifting from the lazy confidence of apex predators to the tight defensive formations of prey animals sensing danger, but the humans weren't finished. "Phase 2, Chen announced. "All ships, execute hunting pattern Delta 7. The human fleet suddenly dispersed, each ship taking a different vector through the enemy formation. But instead of engaging in traditional ship-to-ship combat, they began doing something that defied every principle of space warfare Zephi had ever learned. They started playing with their food. The TDF Retribution swooped down on a bioship nearly 3 times its size, weapons blazing. But instead of delivering a killing blow, the human gunners precisely targeted the creature's sensory organs, blinding it without causing fatal damage. The bioship writhed in apparent agony, its distress calls flooding the bioelectric network that connected the entire enemy fleet. "Why aren't you destroying it?" Zeph-Hai asked, horrified by the display. "Because dead enemies don't spread fear," Chen replied calmly. "But wounded, terrified enemies tell stories." Across the battlefield, similar scenes were playing out. Human ships would single out individual bioships, cripple their weapons and sensors, then move on to the next target. They were deliberately leaving survivors, but survivors who were damaged, confused, and broadcasting their terror to the rest of the fleet. This is torture," Zeph-Hai whispered. "No," Chen corrected. "This is war. Torture is what the Devourers do to the populations they harvest. What we're doing is making sure they understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end." The bioship fleet was beginning to panic. Zeph-Hai could see it in their movement patterns, the way they were clustering together for protection instead of maintaining effective firing positions. The bioelectric network that was supposed to coordinate their attacks was instead transmitting fear and confusion throughout the entire formation. "Admiral Thexra," Chen spoke into the communications array, "you might want to begin your advance. I think our friends are ready to discuss terms." "Terms?" The Admiral's voice was strained. "Commander, they're Devourers." "They don't negotiate." "They do now." As if to prove her point, the communications array suddenly crackled with an incoming transmission. The voice that emerged was unlike anything Zeph-Hai had ever heard from a Devourer. Tentative, uncertain, afraid. Unknown vessels. We wish to discuss cessation of hostilities." The human bridge crew exchanged glances, and Zeph-Hai was disturbed to see several of them smiling. Not the relief of soldiers who had avoided unnecessary casualties, but the satisfaction of craftsmen whose work had exceeded expectations. "This is Commander Chen of the Terran Defense Force," she responded. "Are you prepared to withdraw from this system and release all prisoners? We require negotiation. Terms must be no." Chen's voice cut across the transmission like a blade. "You don't understand the situation. You have exactly 10 minutes to begin withdrawal, or we proceed to Phase 3. There was a long pause, filled only with the background chatter of bioelectric panic from the enemy fleet. What is Phase 3? Chen's smile was predatory. "Phase 3 is where we stop being nice." The silence that followed was broken by the frantic movement of bioships throughout the enemy formation. They were withdrawing, their feeding appendages retracting from the planet's surface as they prepared for emergency departure. "This is impossible," Zeph-Hai said, his mandibles clicking in confusion. "Devourers don't retreat. They don't negotiate. They fight to the death, because they literally cannot conceive of defeat." "They couldn't," Chen agreed, "until today. Now they've learned something new. They've learned what it feels like to be food." As the enemy fleet began its disorganized retreat, Admiral Thexra's voice came through the communications array again. "Commander Chen, this is unprecedented. How did you know this would work?" Chen leaned back in her command chair, watching the bioships flee into hyperspace with the satisfaction of someone whose calculations had proven correct. "Admiral, every species in the galaxy fights like civilized beings. You have rules, protocols, expected behaviors. You fight to achieve military objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency." She gestured to the tactical display, where the last of the Devourer ships was disappearing into hyperspace. "Humans fight differently. We fight to teach our enemies that fighting us is a mistake they don't want to repeat." "But the psychological impact," Admiral Thexra protested. "Those bioships will carry the memory of this encounter throughout their entire network. You may have created a species-wide trauma response." 2-6, Chen said simply. "That's exactly what we did." The casual way she said it sent chills down Zeph-Hai's spine. The humans hadn't just won a tactical victory, they had deliberately traumatized an entire species, and they had done it with the same professional detachment that other species reserved for routine military operations. "Commander," Zeph-Hai said carefully, "I begin to understand why your species has such a reputation for effectiveness, but surely there are ethical considerations." "Captain," Chen interrupted, "how many planets have the Devourers sterilized in the past century?" Zeph-Hai considered the question. "Approximately 43 confirmed attacks, with an estimated population loss of 15 billion sentient beings," Chen finished. 15 billion people who were slowly consumed while still alive. Their neural networks harvested to power bioship computers. "Tell me, Captain, What ethical considerations do I owe to a species that has committed genocide on that scale? It was a fair point, but something about the humans' approach still disturbed HFY on a fundamental level. It wasn't just the effectiveness of their tactics, it was the evident enjoyment they took in applying them. You seem troubled, Captain, observed Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed, the human ship's second officer. Is this your first exposure to asymmetric warfare? I've seen unconventional tactics before, HFY replied, but nothing quite like this. Your people seem to treat warfare as an art form. Ray chuckled, a sound that somehow managed to be both genuinely amused and deeply unsettling. In a way, we do. You have to understand, Captain. Humans evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill us. We survived by becoming better at violence than anything else on the planet. But you're not just violent, HFY observed. You're calculating about it, methodical.
Exactly, Chen said, rejoining the conversation.
Violence without purpose is just brutality. Violence with purpose, that's warfare. And humans have had a very long time to perfect our purpose. The communications array chimed with an incoming transmission from the surface of Kepler 442b. The voice was weak, trembling with relief and residual fear. This is Governor Veltar of the Kepler colony. The Devourers have withdrawn. They've released all prisoners and are fleeing the system. I don't understand what happened, but thank you. Chen activated the response channel. Governor, this is Commander Chen. Your people are safe. Medical ships are en route to provide assistance. Commander, I must ask, how did you accomplish this? Our defenses were completely overwhelmed, and then suddenly they just left. HFY watched Chen consider her response. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. We reminded them that they weren't the only predators in the galaxy.
After the transmission ended, the human bridge fell into a comfortable silence.
The crew continued their duties with the same professional calm they'd shown throughout the engagement, as if terrorizing an entire species into retreat was just another day at the office.
Captain HFY, Chen said eventually, I hope this has been educational for you.
Educational, HFY repeated slowly. Yes, that's certainly one way to describe it. But I find myself wondering what happens next. When word of this spreads throughout the galaxy? Chen's expression grew thoughtful. That's an excellent question. In human military doctrine, we call this the demonstration effect. The idea is that sometimes you need to make an example out of one enemy to discourage others. And you believe this will discourage other aggressive species? I believe, Chen said carefully, that the next time someone is considering whether to attack human interests, they're going to remember what happened here. They're going to remember that humans don't just fight back. We fight in ways that change how our enemies think about conflict entirely. The tactical display now showed empty space where the Devourer fleet had been. Kepler 442b hung peacefully in the void, its population saved by 12 human ships and a form of warfare that existed nowhere in galactic military doctrine. Commander Chen, Admiral Fexra's voice came through the communications array again. The Council is requesting a full debrief on your methods. There are concerns about the precedent this sets. I'm sure there are, Chen replied. Tell the Council that the Terran Defense Force stands ready to provide detailed briefings on our psychological warfare capabilities. I think they'll find our methods quite enlightening. As the human fleet began forming up for the return journey, HFY found himself contemplating the implications of what he had witnessed. The humans had just demonstrated that they possessed capabilities that went far beyond anything the Galactic Council had imagined. They hadn't just won a military victory, they had proven that they understood warfare on a level that other species couldn't even comprehend. Commander, he said finally, I have one more question if you don't mind. Of course, Captain. When you said that humans learn to make other things afraid, what exactly did you learn that from? Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the view screen. When she answered, her voice carried the weight of species memory, of evolutionary history written in blood and survival. We learned it from everything that tried to eat us, she said simply, and then we got better at it than they were. As the TDF Retribution jumped to hyperspace, carrying HFY back to the Council fleet and a report that would reshape galactic military thinking, the Catherian warrior reflected on a comfortable truth. Humanity had just announced their arrival on the galactic stage, not as junior partners in a civilized alliance, but as apex predators who had been politely restraining themselves. The question that would haunt military planners across the galaxy was simple. What else were the humans capable of when they stopped being polite? The council chambers on Nexus Prime had never felt so tense. HFY stood at the central podium, his crystalline carapace reflecting the harsh lights as representatives from 47 different species listened to his report with growing unease. The holographic displays showed tactical recordings from the Kepler 442b engagement, but the numbers and videos failed to capture the true horror of what he had witnessed. To summarize, Admiral Thexra said, her tentacles writhing with barely controlled agitation, 12 human ships defeated a force of over 300 Devourer bioships without destroying a single enemy vessel? That is correct, HFY replied, his mandibles clicking as he spoke. The humans achieved complete tactical victory through psychological warfare alone. A ripple of disbelief ran through the assembled representatives. The Vulcan delegate, a tall insectoid being with compound eyes that glowed within a light, leaned forward in his seat. Captain HFY, with respect, your report suggests capabilities that border on the impossible. Devourers do not retreat. They do not negotiate. They consume everything in their path until they are destroyed. I understand your skepticism, HFY said. I have fought Devourers for over 2 centuries. I have seen entire star systems stripped bare by their feeding fleets, but I have also now seen them flee in terror from an enemy they could not comprehend. The Galactic Council's chief military advisor, a massive Korgan whose species had built their civilization on the principles of honorable warfare, stood to address the assembly. Captain, your report mentions that the humans have been developing these techniques for 50 years? Do we have any intelligence on the extent of their psychological warfare capabilities? Before HFY could answer, the chamber's main doors opened with a soft pneumatic hiss. Commander Sarah Chen walked in, flanked by 2 other human officers, her grey uniform somehow making her appear more intimidating than the elaborate ceremonial armor worn by many of the alien delegates. Chief Advisor Korgan, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Perhaps I can answer that question directly. The silence that followed was profound. Chen had not been invited to this session, and by council protocol, she had no right to speak. But no one moved to stop her as she walked to a secondary podium normally reserved for expert witnesses. Members of the Galactic Council, Chen began, I understand there are concerns about human military doctrine. I'm here to address those concerns and to provide clarification about Terran Defense Force capabilities. Admiral Thexra's chromatophores shifted to an angry red. Commander Chen, this is a closed session. Your presence here is necessary, Chen interrupted. Because this council is about to make decisions based on incomplete information, and those decisions could have consequences that extend far beyond human space. Chief Advisor Korgan's massive form shifted, armor plates grinding against each other. Are you threatening this council, human? Chen's smile was polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying. Not at all, Chief Advisor. I'm offering to educate it. The holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered and changed, now showing a detailed breakdown of human military assets throughout known space. HFY felt his breathing apparatus constrict as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. For 50 years, Chen continued, the Galactic Council has treated humanity as a minor power. Our fleet contributions have been small, our territorial claims minimal, our participation in major conflicts limited to support roles. She gestured to the display. This was by design. The numbers on the display were staggering. Hidden bases, concealed fleet elements, weapons platforms disguised as civilian infrastructure. The humans haven't been building a small defensive force. They have been constructing a military machine that dwarfed anything the Council had imagined. The engagement at Kepler 442b was not an example of human military capability, Chen said calmly. It was a demonstration of human restraint. Delegate Vextar of the Triadic Union, whose people prided themselves on their diplomatic abilities, spoke in a carefully controlled voice. Commander, are you suggesting that humanity has been deliberately deceiving the Council about your military strength?
I'm suggesting, Chen replied, that humanity has been waiting for the right moment to reveal our true capabilities. The Devourer incursion provided that moment.
Chief Advisor Korgan stood to his full imposing height, his battle scars visible even through his ceremonial armor. And what exactly are those capabilities, human? Your report speaks of psychological warfare, but the Korgan have faced down the nightmares of a dozen worlds. We do not frighten easily. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around her. When she spoke again, her voice carried an undertone that made every creature in the chamber remember what it felt like to be prey. "Chief Advisor, would you like a demonstration?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Zephe found himself studying the faces of the other delegates, seeing his own growing unease reflected in their expressions. There was something about the human commander's confidence that suggested she wasn't bluffing. "I think," Admiral Thextra said carefully, "that would be unnecessary. Perhaps you could simply explain the human approach to warfare," Chen interrupted, "is based on a simple principle. We don't fight to win battles. We fight to ensure our enemies never want to fight us again." She manipulated the holographic display showing tactical scenarios that made Zephe's blood run cold. Every major power in this galaxy has developed military doctrine based on the assumption that warfare follows certain rules. You fight for territory, resources, political advantage. You minimize casualties, maximize efficiency, and negotiate when the cost becomes too high. The display shifted to show historical battles, each one highlighting the conventional nature of galactic warfare. That humans developed our military thinking on a world where the rules were different. We learned to fight not for advantage, but for survival. And we learned that the most effective way to survive was to make sure our enemies were too afraid to threaten us again. Delegate Cathara of the Psionic Collective, whose people were renowned for their mental disciplines, spoke in a voice that resonated with psychic harmonics. "Commander, your methods at Kepler suggest a willingness to inflict psychological trauma on a massive scale. The ethical implications are irrelevant," Chen cut her off. "Ethics are a luxury that evolved apex predators can afford. Humanity spent millennia as prey animals who survived by becoming better predators than anything that hunted us." The chamber fell silent as the full implications of Chen's words sank in. She wasn't talking about military tactics or strategic doctrine. She was talking about evolutionary psychology, about the fundamental differences between species that had evolved as hunters and species that had evolved as prey. "Captain Zephe," Chen said, turning to address him directly, "you mentioned in your report that you've been a warrior for 3 centuries. In all that time, how many enemies have you fought who were actively trying to traumatize you?" Zephe considered the question carefully.
None, he admitted.
"Even the most aggressive species fight for comprehensible goals. Territory, resources, dominance. But always with some rational objective." "Exactly. And that's why the Devourers were so successful for so long. They fight like forces of nature. Implacable, incomprehensible, unstoppable. Until they met an enemy who fights the same way." Chen manipulated the display again, showing psychological profiles of various galactic species. Every species in this chamber evolved to fill a specific ecological niche. Some became prey animals who survived through cooperation and intelligence. Others became predators who dominated through strength or cunning. But humans... She paused, letting the suspense build. Humans evolved to be the ultimate invasive species. The term sent a chill through the assembled delegates. Invasive species were a concept every civilization understood. Organisms that could adapt to any environment, consume any available resources, and outcompete native life forms with devastating efficiency. On Earth, Chen continued, humans weren't the strongest, fastest, or most naturally armed species. But we became the most successful because we learned to adapt our behavior to defeat any opponent. We studied our enemies, learned their weaknesses, and developed methods specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. Chief Advisor Corgan's armor plates were grinding audibly now. "You speak as if warfare were a science, human." "For us it is," Chen replied, "and like any science, it can be refined, perfected, and applied with precision." The holographic display shifted to show detailed analysis of various galactic species, psychological profiles, military doctrines, and behavioral patterns. The level of detail was staggering, suggesting that humans had been studying potential opponents for decades. "The Korgan fight for honor," Chen said, highlighting specific data points. "This makes them predictable in certain situations, but also gives them advantages in morale and unit cohesion. The Vel can rely on technological superiority, which can be countered through electronic warfare and adaptive tactics. The Draknari use overwhelming force, which can be defeated through asymmetric warfare and strategic deception. Each species' weaknesses were laid bare with clinical precision." Zephe realized that the humans hadn't just been hiding their military capabilities. They had been conducting a comprehensive intelligence analysis of every major power in the galaxy. "This is..." Delegate Vextar struggled to find the words. "This level of strategic analysis suggests preparation for conflict on a galactic scale. Preparation for any potential conflict, Chen corrected. Human military doctrine is based on the principle that the best way to avoid war is to be so thoroughly prepared for it that potential enemies choose not to fight. Admiral Thexra's chromatophores had shifted to a deep purple that indicated extreme distress. Commander, you're describing a military philosophy that treats every other species as a potential threat. Every other species is a potential threat, Chen replied matter-of-factly. History shows that any species with the capability for interstellar warfare will eventually use that capability for aggressive purposes. The only question is when and against whom. The brutal logic of her statement was undeniable. Even the most peaceful species in the galaxy maintain military forces, and territorial disputes were a constant source of tension throughout known space. So what? Chief Advisor Corbin growled. Is humanity's ultimate objective galactic domination? Chen's laugh was genuinely amused, which somehow made it more unsettling than if she had remained serious. Chief Advisor, domination requires administration. Humans have no interest in ruling over 47 different species with incompatible biologies, psychologies, and social structures. She manipulated the display one final time, showing a strategic overview of human space that emphasized defensive positions and trade routes rather than conquest targets. Our objective is much simpler. We want to be left alone to develop our civilization without interference. But we've learned that the only way to guarantee peace is to make the cost of aggression so high that rational actors choose cooperation instead. And what about irrational actors? Asked Delegate Kathara. The Devourers were not driven by rational considerations, which is why they're now fleeing to the galactic rim with species-wide post-traumatic stress disorder, Chen replied. Irrational actors require different methods, but the principle remains the same. Make the cost of aggression higher than the benefit of cooperation. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the chamber's life support systems. Every delegate was processing the implications of what they had heard, and none of them looked comfortable with their conclusions. Commander Chen, Admiral Thexra said finally, "What exactly are you proposing?" Chen's expression grew serious for the first time since she had entered the chamber. I'm proposing that this council recognize the reality of our current situation. Humanity is not a minor power seeking membership in an established order. We are an apex predator species, offering partnership to our potential prey. The bluntness of the statement was shocking, but Zeph-Hay realized it was also honest in a way that no diplomatic speech had ever been. Partnership, Chen continued, based on mutual benefit and shared security interests. Humans will continue to contribute to galactic stability, but we will do so as equals, not as junior members seeking approval. And if the Council chooses not to recognize this partnership, Chief Advisor Corgan asked, Chen's smile returned, predatory and confident. Then you'll discover what Phase 3 looks like. As the implications of her words sank in, Zeph-Hay realized that the galaxy had just changed forever. The humans hadn't just revealed their military capabilities, they had announced their intention to reshape the fundamental balance of power throughout known space. The question was no longer whether humanity would become a major galactic power. The question was whether the existing order would adapt to accommodate them or whether it would be replaced by something entirely new. Looking around the chamber at the faces of delegates who had spent their careers believing they understood the nature of galactic politics, Zeph-Hay saw his own realization reflected in their expressions. They were no longer the apex predators in this particular ecosystem. And the real predators had just decided to stop pretending otherwise. 3 months after the Kepler incident, Zeph-Hay found himself aboard the Kytherian flagship Eternal Vigilance, watching long-range sensors track the approach of a massive fleet. The ships were unlike anything in conventional galactic design, sleek, predatory vessels that moved through space with the fluid grace of living creatures. The human reinforcement fleet had arrived at the border of consortium space, and with it the reality that everything had changed. Captain! His aide Subcommander Thrixel approached with a datapad clutched in his secondary arms. The human fleet composition is extensive, 734 vessels, ranging from light cruisers to vessels we cannot classify. Zeph-Hay accepted the datapad, his compound eyes scanning the information with growing amazement. The humans had assembled a force that rivaled the entire Galactic Council's combined navy, and they had done it in less than 3 standard months. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Sir, Thrixel continued, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. There have been developments since the council session. What kind of developments? 6 species have formally requested defensive pacts with Terra. The Vulcan Confederacy, the Outer Rim Colonies, the Centauri Trade Union, the New Geneva Corporation, and... He paused, mandibles clicking nervously.
The Draknari supremacy. Zephai's carapace rippled with shock.
The Draknari were proud warriors who had never sought protection from anyone. Their request for a human defensive pact was like watching the galaxy's most dangerous predator seek shelter from something even more dangerous. What changed their minds? The psychological analysis report, sir. After the council session, someone leaked Commander Chen's tactical breakdowns of galactic species. When the Draknari saw exactly how thoroughly the humans understood their military doctrine, their leadership concluded that resistance would be inadvisable. The implications were staggering. In 3 months, humanity had gone from a minor council member to the galaxy's premier military power. Not through conquest, but through the simple demonstration that they understood warfare better than anyone else. Sir, the communications officer called from across the bridge. Incoming transmission from the human fleet. Admiral Sarah Chen requests permission to come aboard for a conference. Admiral Sarah Chen, the woman who had terrorized the Devourers into retreat, had been promoted and given command of humanity's first major fleet deployment. The speed of her advancement suggested that the Kepler incident had been more than a tactical victory. It had been a demonstration that had reshaped human military planning. Permission granted, Zephi replied. Have her escorted to Conference Room Alpha. As he made his way through the corridors of the Catherian flagship, Zephi reflected on the events of the past 3 months. The galaxy had not descended into chaos as many had predicted. Instead, something more subtle and far more profound had occurred. A fundamental shift in how species viewed the balance of power. The Consortium War, which had been raging for 2 years between the hegemony and the Free Worlds Alliance, had suddenly become a matter of galactic concern, not because of its strategic importance, but because both sides had simultaneously requested human mediation. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of a species that could make devourers flee in terror. Conference Room Alpha was already occupied when Zephi arrived. Admiral Chen stood examining a holographic display of the local star system, her grey uniform now bearing the insignia of her new rank. 2 other humans flanked her, a tall, scarred man who radiated the calm confidence of a veteran warrior, and a smaller woman whose cybernetic implants suggested she was a specialist in electronic warfare. Admiral Chen, Zephyr said, offering the formal gesture of military respect that his species used between equals. Welcome aboard the Eternal Vigilance. Captain Zephyr, Chen replied, returning the gesture with surprising precision. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I believe we have much to discuss regarding the current situation. As they took their seats around the conference table, Zephyr noted that Chen's demeanor had changed since their last encounter. The predatory confidence was still there, but it was tempered by something that looked almost like weariness. I confess, Zephyr said, I'm curious about your reasons for requesting this meeting. The Consortium War is officially outside human territorial interests. Chen activated a holographic display that showed the current disposition of forces in the war zone. Captain, in the 3 months since Kepler, we've received 17 requests for military intervention, 23 requests for defensive pacts, and 46 requests for weapons sales. The galaxy seems to have concluded that human military support is the key to victory in any conflict. And is it? Probably, Chen admitted, but that's not the point. The point is that humanity never intended to become the galaxy's military arbiters. We revealed our capabilities to establish our independence, not to become responsible for everyone else's security. The tall man beside her, whom Chen introduced as General Marcus Torres, leaned forward. Captain, we're facing a strategic problem that no human military planner anticipated. Our demonstration of strength was so effective that it's created a power vacuum. Explain. Traditional galactic military doctrine assumed rough parity between major powers, Torres continued. The balance of power depended on the fact that no single species could dominate all others, but our capabilities are apparently so far beyond galactic norms that we've accidentally destabilized the entire system. Zephyr considered this. It was true that the galaxy's political stability had depended on the assumption that military technology and tactics had reached a plateau. Humanity's psychological warfare capabilities had shattered that assumption. What do you propose? He asked. Chen manipulated the holographic display, showing detailed analyses of the various factions in the Consortium War. We propose a demonstration of human military philosophy that goes beyond simple tactical superiority. We're going to show the galaxy what happens when an apex predator species decides to impose peace. The phrase sent chills down Zephae's spine. Impose peace? That sounds uncomfortably close to the conquest you claimed humans had no interest in pursuing. Not conquest. The cybernetic specialist Lieutenant Commander Rivera spoke for the first time. Behavioral modification on a galactic scale. She activated a new display that showed psychological profiles of the major players in the Consortium War. The hegemony leadership, composed primarily of militaristic species, was driven by concepts of honor and territorial expansion. The Free Worlds Alliance was motivated by resource scarcity and fears of cultural domination. Both sides are fighting for rational reasons, Rivera continued, but their conflict has become irrational because they're locked into strategic thinking that prevents them from seeing alternatives to military victory. And humans can provide those alternatives? Chen smiled, and once again Zephae felt that predatory chill. We can provide incentive to find those alternatives. The plan they outlined was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than intervening on behalf of either side in the Consortium War, humanity would demonstrate what would happen to any faction that refused to negotiate. The Hegemony and Alliance have both been using proxy species to conduct their war, Torres explained. Small powers that have been coerced or bribed into providing bases, resources, and cannon fodder for the major factions. We're going to visit each of these proxy species, Chen continued, and explain the benefits of neutrality. How do you intend to be persuasive? Chen activated a new display showing the deployment plan for the human fleet. By demonstrating what happens to the military forces of species that continue to support aggressive actions, Zephae studied the tactical projections with growing horror. The humans weren't planning to destroy enemy fleets. They were planning to systematically dismantle the military capabilities of every species involved in the conflict, leaving them defenseless but alive. This is psychological warfare on a scale that borders on war crimes, he said. Only if you consider it wrong to prevent a war that has already killed 40 million sentients, Rivera replied coldly. The Consortium War has been going on for 2 years because both sides believe they can achieve victory through military action. We're going to prove them wrong. And after you've dismantled their fleets? What prevents them from simply rebuilding? General Torres smiled grimly. The knowledge that we'll dismantle them again and again, as many times as necessary until they decide that negotiation is preferable to humiliation. The plan was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely terrifying. Humanity wasn't planning to conquer the galaxy. They were planning to train it like a misbehaving pet. The psychological implications were staggering. Admiral, Zephae said carefully, I must ask, what role do you envision for the Galactic Council in this demonstration? The Council will observe, Chen replied. And then it will mediate the peace negotiations that follow. We have no interest in governing these species. We just want them to understand that warfare is no longer a viable option for resolving disputes. And if some species refuse to accept this new reality? Chen's expression grew distant, as if she were contemplating something unpleasant but necessary. Then they'll discover what Phase 4 looks like. The mention of Phase 4 sent ice through Zephae's veins. He had witnessed Phase 3 in the Council chambers, where Chen had laid bare humanity's intelligence capabilities and strategic advantages. He had no desire to discover what came after that. Captain, General Torres said, we're sharing this plan with you because the Catherian Republic has always been respected for its military competence and ethical standards. We need witnesses from the galactic community who can testify that our methods, while unconventional, are designed to minimize casualties and prevent future conflicts. You want us to legitimize your actions. We want you to understand our intentions, Chen corrected. The galaxy is about to see human warfare doctrine implemented on a scale never before attempted. When it's over, there will be questions about our methods and our goals. We need voices of authority who can explain that what we did was necessary to prevent something much worse. Zephae studied the tactical displays, trying to comprehend the full scope of what the humans were proposing. It was audacious beyond belief, but the strategic logic was undeniable. If they could succeed in demonstrating that military conflict was futile against human capabilities, they might actually prevent the expansion of warfare throughout the galaxy. How long do you estimate this operation will take? 6 months, Rivera said immediately. We've identified 37 proxy species supporting various factions in the Consortium War. At current fleet capabilities, we can neutralize their military assets at a rate of 1 species per week. Neutralize, Zephae repeated. Not destroy. Correct, Chen confirmed. We're not interested in genocide or conquest. We're interested in behavioral modification. Dead enemies can't learn new behaviors, but humiliated enemies are highly motivated to avoid repeating their mistakes. The conference continued for 3 more hours, with the humans outlining their tactical approach, their rules of engagement, and their post-conflict reconstruction plans. Every detail had been carefully considered, every contingency planned for, every possible outcome analyzed. As the meeting concluded, Chen made one final point, but stayed with Sci-Fi long after she had returned to her fleet. Captain, humanity spent 10,000 years learning to survive on a world that was actively trying to kill us. We became the apex predator not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we were the most adaptable. Now we're applying those same principles to galactic politics. And if your methods fail? If some species prove too stubborn or too proud to accept human dominance? Chen's smile was sad rather than predatory, as if she were contemplating the necessity of doing something she would prefer to avoid. Then we'll adapt our methods until they succeed. That's what apex predators do, Captain. We find a way to win, regardless of what it takes. As the human shuttle departed, carrying Admiral Chen back to her fleet, Sci-Fi stood at the observation deck watching the massive formation of human warships begin their advance toward the war zone. In 6 months, the galaxy would discover whether humanity's vision of enforced peace was possible, or whether they would witness the rise of the most benevolent tyranny in galactic history. The terrifying part was that Sci-Fi found himself hoping the humans would succeed. 6 months later, Sci-Fi stood in the same council chambers where humanity had first revealed its true nature, but the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The Consortium War was over, not through victory or defeat, but through what historians would later call aggressive pacification. Every species that had participated in the conflict was now present for the peace negotiations, their representatives bearing the unmistakable demeanor of beings who had learned a hard lesson about the nature of modern warfare. The holographic display at the center of the chamber showed the final statistics of Operation Peaceful Resolution, as the humans had cynically named their intervention. 37 proxy species had had their military capability systematically dismantled. Not a single ship had been destroyed, not a single life lost in combat. Instead, the human fleet had simply rendered every military vessel in the war zone permanently inoperable through methods that defied conventional understanding. The results speak for themselves, Admiral Chen said, addressing the assembled council with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the operation. All hostilities in the consortium have ceased. All proxy forces have withdrawn to their home territories. Both the hegemony and the alliance have agreed to binding arbitration overseen by the Galactic Council. Delegate Vexstar of the Triadic Union, whose species had been one of the most vocal critics of human methods, spoke with obvious reluctance. Admiral, while the effectiveness of your intervention cannot be disputed, the methods employed, some of our members have concerns about the precedent this sets. Chen's expression remains neutral, but Sci-Fi had learned to read the subtle signals of human body language. There was amusement in her eyes, the look of someone who had anticipated this objection. What precedent, Delegate? That aggression will be met with overwhelming response? That species who choose warfare over diplomacy will find their military capabilities removed. I would think the Council would approve of such precedents. Chief Advisor Corgan rose to his full imposing height, though the gesture seemed less intimidating than it had 6 months ago. Admiral, your forces rendered 37 different fleets completely inoperable without firing a single shot. Our technical specialists cannot even understand how this was accomplished. Nanite swarms, Chen replied matter-of-factly. Microscopic machines that infiltrate enemy ships and selectively disable weapon systems, propulsion, and life support. The technology is a logical extension of human manufacturing capabilities. The casual way she revealed what amounted to the most advanced military technology in galactic history sent a collective shiver through the assembled delegates. Sci-Fi realized that the humans were still holding back, still revealing their capabilities incrementally as circumstances required. The affected vessels can be repaired? Asked Admiral Fexra, her chromatophores showing deep concern. Of course, Chen nodded. The nanites are programmed to cause temporary dysfunction, not permanent damage. Most ships can be restored to full functionality within 6 months, assuming their owners demonstrate a commitment to peaceful behavior.
It was elegant psychological warfare.
The humans hadn't destroyed their enemies' fleets. They had effectively grounded them like misbehaving children, with the implicit promise that good behavior would be rewarded with the return of their toys. And if some species choose not to demonstrate this commitment to peaceful behavior, Chief Advisor Corbin asked. Chen's smile was polite and absolutely terrifying. Then, their ships remain inoperable indefinitely. We found that most species prefer to have functional military assets, even if those assets come with behavioral restrictions. The transformation of galactic politics had been swift and comprehensive. The threat of human intervention had ended not just the Consortium war, but several smaller conflicts that had been brewing throughout the galaxy. Species that had been preparing for territorial disputes suddenly found themselves much more interested in diplomatic solutions. Admiral Delegate Cathara of the Psionic Collective spoke, her mental harmonics carrying undertones of unease. The Council has received reports of unusual psychological effects among the populations that experienced your intervention. Mass anxiety responses, behavioral changes, social disruption, trauma responses, Chen acknowledged. Perfectly normal when a population realizes that its military protection has been rendered ineffective. Most species recover within 6 to 12 months, assuming they adapt their strategic thinking to accept the new reality. The new reality. That phrase had become shorthand for the fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics that humanity had imposed through demonstration rather than conquest. The new reality was that military conflict between spacefaring species was no longer viable, because humans would simply disable any force that attempted it. Some of our analysts, Chief Advisor Corbin continued, have suggested that your intervention represents a form of galactic governance without consent, that humanity has effectively become a military dictatorship, ruling through the threat of superior force. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the faces of the assembled delegates. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of genuine thoughtfulness. Chief Advisor, every form of government ultimately rests on the threat of superior force. The difference is whether that force is used to enable cooperation or to prevent aggression. Humanity has chosen to use our capabilities to make warfare obsolete. And who gave humanity the authority to make that choice for the rest of us? Delegate Vextar demanded. Chen's response was simple and devastating. Evolution. The word hung in the air like a weapon. Every species in the chamber understood the implications. Humanity hadn't been granted authority by some higher power. They had earned it through the same process that determined every aspect of life in the galaxy. Survival of the fittest. The reality, Chen continued, is that human military capabilities have advanced beyond anything the rest of the galaxy can match or counter. We can choose to use those capabilities for conquest, for exploitation, or for the prevention of warfare. We've chosen prevention. For now, muttered someone from the back of the chamber. For as long as it remains the most efficient option, Chen replied calmly. Humanity has no interest in ruling other species, but we have a very strong interest in ensuring that other species don't threaten human interests through military action. HFY found himself studying the faces of his fellow council members, seeing his own complex emotions reflected in their expressions. Fear, yes, but also a grudging relief. The galaxy was more stable than it had been in centuries, with major conflicts ended and aggressive species effectively neutered. The price was the loss of military autonomy for anyone who might threaten the new order. Admiral, he said, speaking for the first time in the session, I have a question about human long-term intentions. Your species has demonstrated the ability to impose peace through superior technology. What happens when that technology becomes obsolete? When some species develops countermeasures to your nanite swarms? Chen's smile was genuinely pleased, as if she had been hoping someone would ask that question. Captain Zefe, that's an excellent question. And the answer is that we'll adapt. Nanite swarms are just our current preferred method of non-lethal force projection. Human military research and development continues to advance at exponential rates. She manipulated the holographic display, showing technical diagrams that made Zeph-Hay's compound eyes widen in amazement. Gravitational manipulation weapons that can collapse enemy ships without harming the crew. Quantum entanglement devices that can disable electronics across interstellar distances. Biological warfare agents that specifically target aggressive behavioral patterns while leaving peaceful populations unaffected. The list went on, each technology more advanced and more terrifying than the last. It became clear that humanity's nanite technology was just the tip of an iceberg that extended far beyond anything the galaxy had imagined. The point, Chen continued, is not the specific capabilities we possess, but the rate at which we develop new ones. Human military technology advances faster than any potential opposition can adapt to it. This creates a stable dynamic where resistance is always futile, but cooperation is always rewarded. Admiral Thexra's tentacles had gone completely still. You're describing a permanent technological advantage that makes all other military development irrelevant. We're describing the logical endpoint of an arms race that began when the first species achieved spaceflight, Chen corrected. Every civilization eventually faces the choice between evolving beyond warfare or being conquered by someone who has. Humanity chose evolution. The session continued for several more hours, with delegates attempting to understand the full implications of the new galactic order. Some questioned the ethics of human methods, others worried about the long-term sustainability of enforced peace, and a few quietly inquired about the possibility of acquiring human military technology for their own use. To every concern, Chen provided calm, logical responses that made it clear that humanity had considered every possible contingency and prepared appropriate countermeasures. The humans weren't ruling through fear alone. They were ruling through the demonstration that resistance was not just futile, but unnecessary. As the session concluded, HFY approached Chen as she was gathering her materials. "Admiral," he said, "I have one final question, if you don't mind." "Of course, Captain." "When this all began, at Kepler 442b, you mentioned Phase 4. After witnessing your methods over the past 6 months, I'm curious. What would Phase 4 actually look like?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, her expression growing distant. When she answered, her voice carried the weight of someone who had contemplated necessary evils and found them acceptable. "Phase 4 is what happens when a species proves too dangerous to be allowed to exist, but too valuable to simply destroy. Permanent technological dependency, constant monitoring, behavioral modification on a genetic level, complete integration into human-controlled systems with no possibility of independence." The casual way she described what amounted to permanent enslavement sent chills through HFY's entire being. "Has any species required Phase 4 intervention?" "Not yet," Chen replied. "But we've identified several candidates whose aggressive tendencies and technological capabilities make them potential threats to galactic stability. So far, demonstration of our capabilities has been sufficient to modify their behavior." As Chen prepared to leave, HFY reflected on the conversation that had started this entire transformation. In the war room 6 months ago, Chen had promised to teach the Devourers what real fear looked like. She had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination, but the lesson had extended far beyond a single enemy. The entire galaxy had learned what fear truly was. The realization that everything they had believed about their own power and importance had been an illusion. The real apex predators had been hiding among them all along, and those predators had finally decided to stop pretending to be harmless. "Admiral," HFY said as Chen reached the door, "one last question. Do humans ever feel guilt about what you've accomplished? About the way you've fundamentally altered the nature of galactic civilization?" Chen paused, her hand on the door control. For the first time since he had met her, HFY saw something that looked almost like vulnerability in her expression. "Every day," she said quietly. "But guilt is a luxury that apex predators can't afford. We do what's necessary to ensure survival, and we live with the consequences." She activated the door control, then paused again. "Captain, humanity didn't choose to be the galaxy's apex predator. Evolution made that choice for us, but we did choose what kind of apex predator we would be. We chose to be the kind that prevents other predators from hunting." As the door closed behind her, HFY was left alone with a realization that would shape the rest of his career. Fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a tool of governance, a method of ensuring compliance, a way of reshaping entire civilizations without firing a shot. Humanity had learned to weaponize fear itself, and in doing so, they had created something unprecedented in galactic history: peace, through the absolute certainty that resistance was impossible. Standing in the empty council chamber, surrounded by the holographic displays that showed a galaxy where warfare had become obsolete, HFY finally understood what he had witnessed. He had seen the birth of a new form of evolution. One where species survived not through adaptation to their environment, but through adaptation to the predators that ruled it. And in that understanding, he realized that he had learned something far more profound than what fear truly was. He had learned what peace truly cost.